presentation like this does feel like, in a certain way, a small thing, but it's actually a big thing that's changing the world, and it's certainly changing the world of MAI for the better, and expanding it into this region world. I'm thinking back years and hearing John's dream for this tab. I'm very grateful. So pardon me for a minute. So it's my pleasure now, after all we've already experienced, to introduce our next speaker. And the speaker is John Maust. John has been the president and CEO of Media Associates International, known here in Latin America as MAI, since 1998. And before that, he was the director of training for MAI, working with the first president, Bob Riki. And before that, he had been a missionary in Guatemala, in Latin America, using his journalistic background and his writing skills, writing articles, writing books. He also was the editor for a number of years of the Latin America Evangelist magazine. I know I'm leaving out a few things. He made a very important discovery in Peru at a certain point in his life, where he met Elsa at a writer training workshop, and then they got married and had a lovely family. And so I will also say John's been a dear friend to me for many years. I'm grateful. So John has selected this topic. This is the shortest way that you can express this concept right here. The most unforgettable things that I've heard you say, top 10 quotes in 35 years of MAI training ministry. So I'm intrigued to hear what these are, John. Let's welcome John Maust.
I don't know about you, but I feel like I have fresh energy after hearing all those taps on the platform again. Well, I'd just like to share a few thoughts of my time with MAI. Dan mentioned 28 years, or actually 29 years with MAI. I didn't want to just talk about myself, and that'd get pretty boring. But I talked to a lot of people who were not boring, had some very significant quotes in my life in terms of the training ministry of MAI. So there are a million quotes a person could draw from. I was just thinking of ones that particularly related to training. We're a training ministry, going around the world trying to help raise up viable Christian publishing houses, successful published writers in their own language, and things like that. So I'm going to do a countdown. I hope you don't get, I hope the tension, the suspense is not too great to see what they're not necessarily in order of importance, but anyway. So as a new staff member with MAI, a quote that was very significant to me was made by a man named Tim Stafford. That may not be a familiar name to a lot of you, but Tim, for many years, was a writer with Christianity Today. He's written a number of books, started a magazine named Step in Kenya years ago. And he said that the strength of the national church is in direct proportion to its body of indigenous Christian literature. So a lot of words in there with multi-syllables. But what he's basically saying is we need more local writing and publishing because the strength of the church depends on it. That's something that, actually Tim was the very first, he led the very first on-site training of MAIs back in 1986 in then Zaire, along with Harun Wachira of Kenya. And basically what Tim was doing that very thing. He was raising up local writers. And I'm thinking of a friend in Chicago who does English language training with Chinese graduate students. And they come to our church, or they meet someplace else, and the Chinese graduate students who are not believers are curious. They want to know more about what is Christianity. So one time, one of those graduate students, a very smart person, very educated, said to my friend, show me on the map of the United States where Jesus was born. And so what does that say? You know, there's this stereotype, there's this impression that Christianity is an imported religion. It's something that's been brought in from the outside. You think of China, why is it that it's much easier to get a Christian book published by a dead Western writer than it is by a living Chinese one? Because they themselves know there's power in that local writer writing in the heart language of the readers, someone who knows that culture and the interests and needs of the readers. So at the heart of really what all we've been trying to do at MAI is to raise up that body of strong, indigenous Christian leaders. Sometimes I say homegrown. It's something that springs up from the roots. And when that happens, that's really exciting. Quote, top quote number 9. My name is Mary and I attend workshops. This is one of the first workshops I did in an unnamed country. And we were just going around the room and I'm Jose, and I'm so-and-so, and I'm a teacher, and a carpenter. And Mary, bless her heart, said, I'm Mary and I attend workshops. And I think I gave Mary kind of a bad rap in my mind about that because I was thinking, oh wow, gee, I attend workshops. And I thought about myself, I'm John Maust and I've attended 16 LittWorlds. So not a lot of difference there. But, you know, the positive part of that is Mary wanted to learn. And not everybody wants to learn. Or to continue learning. Mark mentioned to continue learning even as we get up. You know, we've been at this at a long time. And one thing that I've noticed, maybe you have too, in various countries of the world, new believers have a real hunger to learn. Like everything. You know, not just the Bible, but they really want to learn. It's something really unique. I think when God makes us a new creature, as a believer, you know, the mind is renewed. And people really want to learn. I can think of many examples of that. But really, what's the most important part about that quote is, obviously, it's not just the point of attending workshops. As we love to have large workshop attendances, but that's not the point of it. The important thing is what happens after the workshop. And as we think of ourselves here, you know, a lot of us came a long way to go to LittWorld. And it's significant. We make some new friends. We have some memorable spiritual experiences maybe. But the bottom line is what is going to happen after the workshop. That's our prayer for each of us here. Even if there's only one thing that you're going to put into practice after this, it will make it all worthwhile. Or any training that man does, that one thing. And that is our goal, that things actually happen as a result. Okay, let's go to top 10 quote number 8. I'll never forget this dear friend who said this. He's known by some of us in the room. Archbishop Joseph Barang Atem of South Sudan. We have to get going in our writing. When someone dies, their story is gone. We don't want that to happen anymore. And he didn't want it to happen anymore, so Archbishop Joseph, with help from Barine Kerimi, where are you, Barine? Are you out there someplace? He's been very instrumental in helping the Episcopal Church of South Sudan Life Publishers get launched, and they are actually now in the process. They have published books written by South Sudanese writers. So some stories will not be lost. They will be preserved. It's one of the great functions we can perform as writers and publishers is to rescue some of these stories. I mean, I think personally that the work that we do here, and a lot of you are doing, is it's like finding buried treasure. You know, it's under the ground someplace, and it's not worth anything until somebody actually digs it up. So as we go around doing training, encouraging writers, we often unearth incredible stories that would not be told otherwise unless somebody would have come along and helped draw that out of the person who has that incredible story, and while they're still living. That's so important. Sometimes MAI has done, like, help develop local church histories, testimonies in Vietnam, a book of testimonies, just amazing, powerful testimonies. So, yeah, we don't want amazing stories of God's work to get lost. We want to preserve those stories. And thank God for Archbishop Joseph for what he's doing. We'll stay in Africa on top 10 quote number 7. Some of you know Joanna Ilbudu. She actually wanted to be at this conference, but she's had some health issues and was unable to come. I met her first time in the UK at one of the LittWorld. She could just barely speak English. She was a French literature teacher in Burkina Faso, and she had a dream to start a magazine called Contact. And she and her husband invested their life savings to start that magazine. They spent all the money basically that they had to start this magazine. They came out of the university IFES movement, and they started this magazine. And so interestingly enough, out of that magazine grew a number of ministries. It's interesting. I've seen this several times, maybe you have too. I can think of Breakthrough in Hong Kong, where a magazine was launched, and out of that grew a lot of different ministries. For Joanna, out of that single magazine grew ministry to widows, to orphans, schools, educational projects. And one time I was visiting her. It's probably one of the hottest places I've ever been. And we were walking over to this little concrete block building that she and her husband, again, they borrowed money to build for the magazine. And so there we were walking across this dusty road to this building, and she said this. She said, you know, John, a lot of people have vision when they have money, but when they don't have money, they don't have vision. And it always stuck with me. You know, it's easy to do a lot of things when you have money. Maybe they not that significant, but you can do them. And sometimes I think we're held back. I mean, I've experienced this sometimes in MAI. You think, oh, we don't have a lot of money, we really can't do this. But we should not let that be an impediment. Just resources. We can't really make money an excuse for not doing something, or even more important, I would say, for not doing it well. People say, oh, I can't really do this. You don't have the resources like those US publishers. You can still do things well. Excellence is the trademark that we really want to see in Christian publishing, that they be the best in terms of the content, as well as the presentation. That's important as well. So, yeah, hats off to Joanna Ilbudu for putting that into practice. Okay, top 10 quote number 6. We're going to go down to Europe. One of my more memorable experiences in MAI has been visiting Albania soon after the fall of communism. Some of you know Besa Shaplo, who started the Miracle magazine. Besa was an interpreter. After the fall of communism, different preachers were coming into the country. She was interpreting for one of those preachers, and she received Christ as a result of interpreting an evangelistic message. And very soon after that, she was helping with a ministry that was showing a Christian children's program. It's called Flying House, and kids could write in if they wanted to know more. And she was part of that group fielding those letters. We got so many letters, they decided to start the magazine. What impressed me the most about that magazine was the super faithful following that it had. They formed miracle clubs, these child readers, that were getting a magazine. They would meet and have camps and activities. And that magazine targeted kids from maybe 7 years old to 10 or 11. And so one girl who was reaching that cutoff age, she asked Besa one time, do you have a magazine for kids my age, like middle schoolers? And Besa said, oh, I'm sorry, we don't really have that yet. And so this reader said, if getting older means I can no longer read Miracle magazine, I don't want to grow up. I just really love that. And I share that because isn't it wonderful when we as Christians in writing and publishing, that we identify so much with our readers, and they do with us, that relationship. I always say that being a writer and a publisher, it's not like maybe what I'm doing now where you're kind of talking down to people. It's like you're sitting on a park bench. You have that relationship going, you're interacting. And magazines are really good for that, building relationship, and books are too. So I hope that all of us are building those kinds of relationships with our readers. Okay, top 10 quote number 5. I think Robert Reeke's name has been mentioned already. He was my predecessor at MAI. And here's a quote from Bob. We need to have an undying belief in the other person's ability. We need to encourage, to show, to challenge, to be patient, and to never lose heart. I said in briefly on Kayla's writer workshop, or workshop and writer workshop today, and the question was raised, well, what do we do if we have somebody in a workshop, you know, this person really doesn't seem to have the tools. I mean, do we keep working with that person over a long period of time, or do we just kind of be honest and maybe say, I'm sorry, then maybe you should pursue another type of ministry or something like that? So yeah, there are those occasions where maybe somebody really wants to be a writer or an editor or publisher, and that's really not their gift, but it's worth exploring, but maybe that's not their gift. But we at MAI have always felt that we should, our initial motto was discovering talent, equipping for excellence. That part, discovering talent, was really important. You know, because a lot of times it's the people who are the quietest in a workshop who are probably the most gifted. They're kind of introverted. They don't really ask questions, but they're listening. They're listening to everything. And they're not missing a word. And when Bob would talk about these things, his classic illustration was Barnabas. You know how, we all know the story, I think, where Barnabas and Paul had this dispute over whether or not to take John Mark on mission journey number 2. Because John Mark, you know, as we know, we don't know exactly why, but he left mid-trip and gone back home. So Paul was, I think, really disappointed in him and felt, you know, this man is really not cut out for this kind of ministry. So Barnabas, of course, said, well, no, he saw something in John Mark that Paul did not see. And so he went. I think it took a lot of courage, don't you? It took a lot of courage for Barnabas to break off from, you know, the top missionary of all time, probably. So he split off and took Barnabas with him to Cyprus. But we all know, again, how that finished. You really have to ask your question, would we have the Gospel of Mark without Barnabas? You know, John Mark could have just gotten bitter and dropped out, basically, you know. But no, he went on to write the Gospel of Mark. It was probably the ghostwriter of Peter, or Peter's epistles. So where would we be? The world would have lost, the church would have lost incredibly without Barnabas having that gift of discernment. I think it's a gift. It's a real gift. Bob had it. I mean, you can identify potential in somebody that maybe others can't. So that's always our prayer for our trainers, for me, for everybody, for Ramon, for all of us involved, that we'll have that discernment to identify that person who maybe is kind of a diamond in the rough, who can be cultivated and encouraged to go forward, and to not lose heart. There'll be failures, there'll be, you know, it's not 100% guaranteed that it's going to work always, but with God's help, it can. Okay, now we're going to go to this quote number 4 from an infamous editor named Dan Elliott. Now, I heard Dan share this. Maybe I'd heard it before, but we were doing an editorial training workshop in the Philippines, and that was something that Dan mentioned. It always stuck with me because I think sometimes in publishing, we can become very pragmatic, materialistic. You know, we're about publishing books, and we just want to get that out there however we can get it done. And if we have to run a little roughshod over our author, you know, what's the matter if you get this in here? Then we're maybe tempted to do that. But as Dan said, we don't publish books, we publish authors. These are real life people that we're working with issues and needs and challenges. So what can we do to really help them move further along in their writing? A book that was interesting for me to read, maybe you've seen it, called Dear Scott, Dear Max. It's a series of letters between Maxwell Perkins, who was one of the best-known editors in the U.S. back in the day. He edited Ernest Hemingway, Thomas Wolfe, blanking right now, a number of our very best writers. And his letters to these writers often did not even focus on their writing. He just focused on them as individuals, the friendships, the relationships that were formed with these writers, who, even though they were incredibly gifted, they had issues, they had needs, they just wanted to talk about. And in addition to how to write a better lead sentence or something. So we do want to help writers craft the best story possible, and we are servants of God. Judith Markham, former board member and editor, was always fond of saying the editor is the servant of God, of course, the publishing house, the reader, and then the author. An editor is a servant. Now for top quote number 3, we've got to get something in here from Latin America. And this relates to editing again. I tend to pull those kinds of quotes because these things are so essential to raising up and equipping new writers to be successful. Actually, I didn't hear, I know Samuel Escobar, I didn't actually hear him say this. To me personally, I read it in an article that he wrote. He was remembering Alejandro Clifford. How many of you have heard of Alejandro Clifford? I wish I would have met him because over the years I've heard of so many people who were influenced by him. Rene Padilla, Samuel Escobar, and numerous others. He was an editor of a magazine in Argentina for many years. So anyway, Samuel, who wrote articles for Alejandro Clifford, often he would give his articles to Clifford and wanting his feedback. Then he'd go back after Clifford had read it, and he was expecting, wow, Samuel, fantastic article, things like that. But when he would go back, Alejandro Clifford would kind of look down over the top of his glasses and he would say, Samuel, what were you trying to say? Now that's a disarming question. And so he was kind of offended by that, you know. I said, what do you mean, what am I trying to, you read the article? No, he said, tell me, what were you trying to say? And so Samuel in a few sentences would say, well, this was what I was trying to say. And then Clifford would say, well, why didn't you say that? I love that story. Because I think sometimes we as writers, we get so close to our material that we just assume that everybody understands what we're saying, but they don't. And so one of the greatest roles we have as an editor or publisher is to help that author clarify, make clear the main point. I think Mark Carpenter, I've heard Mark say that one of the best things that he could do with his authors was just have them into the office and talk about what they want to write about. And in the process of expressing it verbally, it kind of became clear what it is they want to say. And speaking of writing clearly, I want to just recognize Lizzie Seiss. She was mentioned here. If you've ever attended one of her workshops, she would always quote Ecclesiastes 12:10. The teacher searched to find just the right word, and what he wrote was upright and true. There's a big difference between the right word and the not so right word. That's where the good writing comes in, to know just the right word to use. Or to put it a different way, as Mark Twain said, it's a big difference between lightning and a lightning bug. You know, you want to have the right word that expresses your meaning, and that's hard work. And so now we're down to top 10 quote number 2. It's by a good friend who's now with the Lord, Julie Link. Worked for many years with the Upper Room, doing the devotionals and the Zondervan. She said, anyone can put words on a page. Only God can breathe life into them. It's kind of a mysterious quote for me because, you know, we really aspire to excellence in writing and publishing. We want to see the very best quality writing in terms of style, in terms of just, you know, the vocabulary and the content in general. But sometimes even the very best writing does not connect. You know, it's kind of a mystery why it is that God sometimes will use something you never dreamed that he would use to touch somebody's life, whereas a magnificent book may just kind of fall flat. It's really and truly a God thing. When God takes a piece of writing and uses it to transform a reader's life, sometimes I feel in our MAI literature, we talk about life-transforming literature, like casual life-transforming literature, that's what. But that's, every time that happens, it's amazing, it's a miracle. It's similar to what Peter on the day of Pentecost, he was preaching, and the people, when they responded to him, do you remember what they asked? What the scripture says? It says they were cut to the heart. I love that. They were cut to the heart. I mean, that got through the head to the heart. Too often we go only to the head and not to the heart. But with the Holy Spirit, that can happen, and when it does, it's a real cause of celebration in heaven and on earth. When something that we write, you know, something we never even hear, it's something we've written or published. You know, we'll never know. Preachers sometimes get that immediate feedback. We don't get that immediate feedback. But then maybe God in His grace years later will say, you know, I came across your book and helped me keep going in my walk with the Lord. And you think, wow, I never knew that. Wow. It's a gift from God when we hear those stories. So now we're down to top 10 quote number one of my favorite people from the early years in MAI, Edward England. I mentioned Maxwell Perkins, the great editor in the U.S., so I don't even think you can measure up near to Edward England, an amazing editor and publisher. I just want to give you a little bit of the background of this quote. Edward was working in a bookstore in London, and I think he'd been there quite a while. Some of you from the UK probably know the story better than I do. But one day on the way into work on the train, he happened to be reading a book by Paul Tournier called The Adventure of Living. And that book was really, talk about a book kind of getting to your heart. He was reading that book, and as he read it, he just was feeling really discontent about his job at the bookstore that was kind of, he didn't dislike it, but it wasn't really going anywhere. And so what should he do? And by the time his train got into London, he had decided to quit his job, actually. I mean, he got up in the morning, that had never even crossed his mind. So he got to London, sure enough, he went and told his boss, I'm really sorry, I've enjoyed my work here, but I'm going to turn in my resignation. He said, well, what are you going to do? I don't know. He thought he was probably kind of nuts. So Edward England then went back home, and he told his wife, I quit my job today. And she burst out in tears, you never told me. And it was just a life-transforming moment in his life when he did that. But as he prayed about it and he thought about it, what would God have him to do, publishing came to his mind. He didn't really know anything about publishing. He knew about books because he had been in a bookstore, run a bookstore, and things like that. But publishing he didn't really know, but he thought, well, maybe that's something God would have me to do. And so he interviewed, he got a job at Hutter and Stoughton, and on his first day on the way into work, before he went into the office, he went into a church, sat down on the pew, and this was his prayer. Do not let me be a publisher unless our books have something to say to those who go thirsty to the well for water. I love that. I really love that because it gets at the heart of why we do this in the first place. There are a lot of kinds of writing that we can do, and all of it, a lot of it is really important. We need good textbooks. We need news articles, well written. We need a lot of different kinds of things that are well written. But when I think of the term Christian writing, and that doesn't mean as Christians we can't write other things besides Christian writing, but when I think about the term Christian writing, it's any piece that we create for the purpose of making a spiritual difference in the lives of our readers. It could be a major difference, it could be just a slight tweak to get us back on track. But there are people out there, as we know, readers, people hungry for a message of hope. Hope, that's been the theme of our work the last couple of years. People are hungry for hope, real hope. And words that will give them encouragement to keep on going. Words of life with a capital L. So in Edward England's case, that was his prayer. And it's my desire that that's all of our prayer. That as we work day after day at that typewriter in our office and we wish we were out walking around in the park or something, that we're about creating words that we pray will go to those, will say something to those who go thirsty to the well for water. So what better reward than that? What better kind of vocation ministry could we have than that? To know that the words that we create will give the water of life of Christ to readers. And not only just for now, but for generations to come, God willing, that the stuff that we create today, if the Lord hasn't returned, will continue to go on impacting lives for a generation, not just where we live, but around the world. So that's our prayer for us. What greater motivation to keep on going. I look forward to staying in touch with you all, and I look forward to hearing how God continues to use you. So, thank you very much.